At precisely 2:11 a.m., under the shroud of royal silence, Prince George slipped past 2 layers of palace security. What he did next left royal aides scrambling, and when King Charles was notified, he reportedly stared at the message for 5 full minutes before whispering, "He's made his move." What caused the future king to defy protocol so blatantly, and why was Camilla left out of the briefing? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For generations, the monarchy has been built upon the principle of order, of unshakable routine, perfectly executed appearances, and carefully managed bloodlines. But in the dead of night, a 12-year-old heir to the throne shattered that legacy in one bold movement that none of the palace guards, aides, or senior advisors could have predicted. George, always seen as dutiful and composed, triggered a silent alarm not through rebellion, but precision. His departure from his quarters wasn't a panicked escape, it was orchestrated. 2 internal passage doors, one of which is accessible only to senior royals, were unlocked. Staff on duty swore they hadn't seen him pass, while others claimed they'd heard a faint tap, followed by a whisper that sent chills. "Tell them, I'll write my own fate." The boy who bore the future of the monarchy had vanished, if only briefly, but the impact was immediate. When the first alert reached the internal communications channel, the palace command team hesitated. There was no emergency protocol for a royal child, enacting what appeared to be a calculated protest. Aides were divided, some feared a kidnapping, while others believed it was an internal act of sabotage, possibly involving palace loyalists. But when Charles received the message, his response shocked even his most seasoned advisors. He cancelled 2 scheduled briefings, including one with military officials, and retreated to his private residence. Aides close to him reported he seemed shaken, muttering to himself and repeatedly asking, "Who guided him?" Yet no directive was issued to the press, no explanation shared with Camilla, who only found out hours later through a third-hand source in the East Wing. More troubling was Catherine's absence from the chain of communication. It was nearly 3 hours after George's disappearance that she was informed not by her husband, not by a royal aide, but by her personal assistant, who noticed increased security movement. She immediately confronted Charles, demanding answers. The confrontation remained private, but what followed was even more unsettling. Surveillance footage of George's wing had been wiped clean from all royal records. One palace technician admitted privately that the entire databank from that night had been overwritten, though no one knew by whom. Only one gardener, a quiet man known to have worked in the outer courtyard since Elizabeth's reign, claimed to have seen George crossing the Fountain Walk just before 3 a.m. When asked what the boy looked like, he simply said, "Determined." Speculation quickly turned to intent. Did George plan this as a symbolic protest? Was he acting alone or under quiet encouragement from someone deeper within the royal structure? Theories emerged about a coded message discovered on a page torn from a royal lineage book hidden in George's waste bin, bearing only the phrase, "break the wheel." Whether metaphor or instruction, no one could decipher the full meaning. But one thing became clear: this was no impulsive act. It was strategic, calculated, and deeply personal. But it wasn't just the act of rebellion. It was what Prince George left behind in his room that truly shook the palace. In the heart of George's meticulously kept quarters, a handwritten letter lay folded atop the Windsor crest. Addressed to the future I refuse, it detailed grievances, suspicions, and one chilling phrase, "I will not wear a crown soaked in silence." For the palace, it wasn't just a letter. It was a declaration of war from within the heir's chamber. The letter was found by the same aide who'd first noticed George's disappearance, a veteran of the royal household, who had served under Queen Elizabeth and had never once breached protocol. But as he read the contents, his hands reportedly trembled. George's words weren't the scribbles of a confused child, they were deliberate, strategic, and devastating. He questioned the very foundation of the crown, asking why records of past monarchs had been sealed and why certain royal figures were spoken of only in whispers. He named no names directly, but referenced entombed legacies and histories erased before they were born. The implication was unmistakable. George had uncovered truths that had been buried truths, that called into question the monarchy's moral compass and its willingness to confront its own ghosts. What shocked Heir'S even more was the personal tone directed toward his own family. The letter spoke of Catherine, not as a sovereign-to-be, but as a mother who cried in private and smiled in public because the institution demanded it. He wrote, "I've seen her tears stain pillows that no one in the council would dare touch," revealing that behind the grace and strength the world admired, George had witnessed a private suffering he could no longer ignore. William, too, was described not as a father, but as a man carrying a nation while suffocating under his own expectations. George's insight into their emotional burdens added a harrowing depth to his message. It wasn't merely political, it was deeply human. But perhaps the most damning passage was aimed at Queen Camilla. While he never mentioned her title directly, George wrote of those who whisper above the monarch and strike silence below him. He accused unnamed figures of manipulating influence, of distorting truths to maintain control, and of rewriting the past to secure a future that did not include voices like his. The letter ended not with a plea, but with a promise: "You cannot crown what is already awakening." This is not a rebellion. This is remembrance. The palace found itself stunned not just by the letter's message, but by its elegance, its clarity, and its unmistakable intent. Was this merely a teenage crisis turned poetic, or had George been quietly preparing for this revelation for months? Debates erupted behind closed doors. Some senior staff dismissed it as a momentary lapse, the angst of a boy crushed by royal pressure. Others believed it was meticulously planned, and that George had allies, perhaps even protectors, within the royal machinery. All eyes turned to Anne, the family's quiet enforcer of legacy, who had been seen speaking privately with George in the weeks before the incident. Had she warned Charles of this coming storm and been ignored? But what triggered such a bold stance from a teenage heir? A private meeting weeks earlier may hold the key. Princess Anne, fierce in silence and unmatched in loyalty, reportedly shared with George a private account of the late Queen's final days, details even King Charles refused to acknowledge. What Anne whispered that day would dismantle George's image of the throne and set him on a path of quiet resistance. The encounter wasn't scheduled, nor was it recorded in any official royal diary. It happened in a rarely used room within Balmoral, one that Anne insisted remain untouched since Elizabeth's last summer there. George had been escorted in under the guise of a historical briefing, but what unfolded was far more personal. Anne, her voice low and deliberate, began to recount not the ceremonies or speeches of the late Queen's final days, but her doubts, her regrets. Elizabeth, the woman who defined monarchy for a generation, had confided in her daughter that the institution she had worked tirelessly to protect might have become too heavy, too blind to the pain it imposed on those within it. She spoke of a clarion directive, a document sealed and hidden deep within the archives, containing instructions meant to be revisited only if the monarchy ever stood on the edge of fracture. Anne claimed she'd never opened it, but she had shown the envelope to George. And as he held it in his hands, the future shifted. George was stunned not because the Queen had doubts, but because no one had ever told him she did. The history books presented her as resolute and unwavering, yet here he was, hearing that even the crown's strongest symbol had once questioned its weight. When Anne asked him if he understood what that meant, George reportedly replied, "Is my path already chosen, or can I still choose?" It was not a rhetorical question, it was a challenge, one Anne had long anticipated. She answered with nothing but a nod. From that moment, the narrative George had been fed since birth began to crumble. He realized he was not being raised to understand the monarchy, he was being conditioned to submit to it. The emotional power of Anne's confession left George deeply unsettled. It wasn't just a moment of bonding between aunt and nephew. It was a pass-in of invisible knowledge, a torch of truth that had been denied to him by his father. He began to question everything: the restrictions on his education, the curated speeches, the absence of historical documents about abdications and family scandals. Even the silence surrounding Princess Diana began to feel more ominous than respectful. When George later asked William about the directive, his father froze, then quickly changed the subject. It was in that silence that George recognized a pattern, one he could no longer ignore. Camilla, sensing a shift in George's demeanor, allegedly tried to intervene. Multiple aides confirmed she had requested to limit George's unsupervised time with Anne, citing emotional fatigue and unnecessary exposure to institutional critique. Her request was denied by Charles, but not without hesitation. Some insiders now believe Camilla feared Anne's influence more than anyone else in the family, for Anne carried the weight of Elizabeth's final judgment and refused to bury it beneath royal protocol. In hindsight, that quiet meeting at Balmoral may have been the ignition point, the precise moment where George stopped being a passive heir and became a conscious challenger. It wasn't an act of teenage defiance. It was the awakening of a mind once silenced, now demanding to be heard. And Anne, perhaps the most underestimated figure in the royal order, had become the whisper that cracked the crown. But George wasn't alone in his unease. His closest ally within the palace had been quietly preparing for the day he would act. Behind palace walls, Charlotte had long been seen as the composed royal, but in a private exchange caught on a discarded staff tablet, she was heard whispering, "They can't control us forever, George." What did the young princess know, and how long had she been waiting for her brother to make the first move? That quiet sentence, spoken in a hushed tone between siblings who should have still been thinking of schoolwork and stables, sent a shock through the palace once intercepted. A junior staffer, tasked with resetting a tablet used for casual in-house monitoring, accidentally accessed an unsaved voice note file likely captured through an enabled microphone during a seemingly routine evening walk through the royal garden paths. What they heard was not the laughter of two carefree children. It was the cryptic, emotionally weighted voice of Princess Charlotte, challenging a system that had already begun to mold her into something she never asked to become. "Protocol Glenmore," she said softly. "It's the plan for when you and I become too aware." The staffer froze, copied the file, and forwarded it to a single superior who, instead of erasing it, made the mistake of letting it circulate. Charlotte's words suggested not only awareness of internal royal mechanisms, but of her role within them, something far beyond her years. And the way she spoke to George, confidently, supportively, and almost strategically, led many to believe she had been preparing for this shift far longer than anyone realized. Insiders say this wasn't just the naive venting of a royal child, but the revelation of a sister who had already decided to align her fate with her brother's rebellion. They were no longer just children of the future. They were quiet agents of change in a system that had long underestimated their emotional intelligence. As the recordings spread through inner palace channels, aides were divided. Some insisted it was harmless, an out-of-context quote from a stressed young girl under pressure. But others feared it pointed to a far deeper fracture within the younger generation of royals. Charlotte's mention of Protocol Glenmore was especially chilling. It was not a term ever taught in standard briefings. It referred to a long-ignored clause within the family's internal operating charter, meant to be activated if two or more royal heirs displayed resistance to ceremonial expectations. It hadn't been reviewed since the early 1980s, and now somehow Charlotte knew it by name. Those closest to Catherine, particularly within her personal security team, reportedly protected Charlotte in the days that followed. Surveillance staff who had been assigned to track George's movements were quietly told to restrict their monitoring near Charlotte's wing. Catherine had begun to use her own authority to shield her daughter from being watched, just as she'd tried to protect George. But this time, it was no longer a matter of avoidance. It was resistance. The siblings had formed an unspoken alliance, operating in parallel under the very nose of the monarchy's senior power players. And no figure loomed larger in their quiet rebellion than Queen Camilla. Camilla's fury was immediate upon hearing the clip. Aides said she demanded the full transcript and called an urgent meeting with her personal staff. She wanted access logs, surveillance histories, and records of who had last interacted with the children alone. But her request was denied not by Charles, but by the Lord Chamberlain, who reminded her of the privacy protocol instated during Elizabeth's reign to protect minors from internal political manipulation. It was a subtle check, but one that sent a clear signal. Camilla's influence, though vast, had its limits. Charlotte, once dismissed as the quiet, obedient daughter, had emerged as a voice of restrained but defiant strength. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't staged a public display. But in that one whisper to her brother, she'd revealed a storm brewing in the youngest corners of the House of Windsor, a storm no protocol could contain. And while the royal children stirred the future, the past returned to haunt the present through a voice Charles never expected to hear. Buried within the royal archives and previously marked for destruction, a cassette labelled 1996 for them was unearthed. Diana's voice, tender, urgent, defiant, spoke directly to a future she feared might repeat itself. What George heard that night changed everything. And when Charles heard it, he wept. The discovery wasn't part of any planned review. George had been granted limited access to certain historical records under the supervision of a palace tutor, as part of what was termed a private history immersion. It was supposed to be curated, filtered, and monitored. But one mislabeled box had slipped past the eyes of protocol. Inside it, tucked beneath reports of Princess Diana's charity travels, was a plain, dust-worn cassette. Written in the late princess's own handwriting were the words 1996, for them. No date stamp, no summary, just a mother's message to children who had yet to become men. Against royal instruction, George asked to play it alone. And the moment the tape rolled, the past bled into the present. Diana's voice cracked through the speakers with a mixture of heartbreak and steel. She spoke of corridors filled with whispers, of truths buried to protect reputations, and of how the institution she had once tried to humanize had instead tried to erase her. She warned of manipulation of powerful figures who shaped the legacy of the throne through fear and secrecy. But most haunting of all was her mention of a mother's promise. A vow, she said, that she'd made not to the crown but to her sons. If they try to shape you before you've grown, resist. If they tell you silence is loyalty, remember your voice was given to you for a reason. Don't let them silence you. George sat frozen, reportedly listening to the tape 3 times before finally locking it away in the top drawer of his writing desk. The moment palace archivists realized which tape had been accessed, alarms went up, not literal ones, but chains of frantic messages, panicked calls and security pings to determine who authorized the breach. King Charles was informed during a scheduled diplomatic debrief. He was told simply, "Your son has heard her voice." According to one senior aide, the king's eyes filled instantly. He waved everyone out of the room, played the tape himself, and sat unmoving for over 20 minutes. No orders were given, no denials were issued. Just a single phrase, whispered like confession, "She warned us." Camilla's reaction, however, was volcanic. The moment she learned that George had heard Diana's personal message, she reportedly demanded to know why such materials were ever preserved. Her voice was said to have echoed across the West Wing when she shouted, "That tape should have been destroyed!" But it hadn't, and worse still for her, it had been heard. One insider claimed she stormed out after hearing Diana's line, "They will try to erase what doesn't benefit them," recognizing all too well the accusation in that sentence. And with that, the fragile boundary between past guilt and present defiance collapsed. The rediscovery of the tape reframed everything. George wasn't just reacting to present injustices, he was channeling a legacy deliberately buried. He had felt his grandmother's caution, his aunt's warning, and now his own mother's voice urging him not to disappear into the machinery of royal silence. In those words, George found clarity and a call to action. And unlike those who came before him, he refused to suppress it. The crown had tried to silence the past, but now the future was speaking out, and the storm could no longer be contained. Inside the private marble room, Catherine didn't ask for permission. She stood before Charles not as Princess of Wales, but as a mother. "He's not your pawn," she said coldly. It was the moment the quiet tension between monarch and mother exploded into a full confrontation, and no one walked out unchanged. The room had been silent for too long. After days of withheld responses and icy formalities, Catherine demanded clarity not just as a royal, but as the mother of the boy they were all now whispering about behind doors. Charles, cloaked in the armor of monarchy, tried to deflect with phrases about duty and damage control. He warned her of optics, of constitutional integrity, of the chain reaction that could be set off if George's rebellion was not stamped out quickly. But Catherine cut through the ceremonial script with brutal truth. "You want a future king who obeys, not understands, but I will not raise a hollow heir," she snapped. It was a moment that ripped the veil from years of unspoken frustrations, and for the first time, Charles wasn't speaking to his daughter-in-law, he was facing a mother at war for her child's agency. The confrontation wasn't loud, but it was seismic. Charles attempted to redirect the conversation, invoking constitutional stability, the expectations of Parliament and international observers who were beginning to question George's absence from upcoming ceremonial appearances. Catherine didn't flinch. She leaned forward and called out what others only dared to whisper, that Camilla had overstepped, that her unchecked influence over family affairs was not only eroding trust, but provoking fear in George himself. "He's spoken more honestly to Anne and Charlotte than he's ever been allowed to speak to you," she said, her voice calm but seething. "Because every time he questions, Camilla answers for you." William, caught between the two pillars of his world, stood frozen. He had always tried to play the part of the bridge, the quiet peacekeeper, the son who understood duty and the husband who valued compassion. But now, his silence was breaking him. Charles turned to him for support, but all William could offer was a single line that echoed across the marble walls like a surrender. He's not wrong to ask. It wasn't permission, it was protection, soft, subtle, but undeniable. And it shifted the atmosphere in an instant. Charles's face fell, not in anger, but in reluctant understanding. For a moment, the image of the stoic king cracked, and what remained was a father torn between two generations, his own legacy and the future he could no longer fully command. He whispered, "He's too young to carry the weight of change." Catherine stepped back, reached into her coat, and placed an envelope on the ornate table between them. "Then let him choose if he wants to carry it at all," she replied. Written on the front, in her own hand, were the words, "Let him decide." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving a stunned monarch and a speechless prince in her wake. The envelope remained unopened, but its presence changed everything. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder that the next chapter of the monarchy might not be dictated from above, but chosen from within. But even as the family fractured behind closed doors, the outside world was about to witness the fallout of George's defiance. When Camilla issued a royal directive to restrict George's future appearances, she expected swift compliance. Instead, 3 departments refused to act. One senior aide resigned on the spot, another locked themselves in the royal archives, and whispers of clarion override sent panic through royal halls. The directive came without warning. Issued in Camilla's name and backed by a small circle of loyal advisors, it demanded a temporary suspension of George's participation in all upcoming public engagements. The reasoning, according to T. memo, was to protect the psychological well-being of the young heir amid escalating public scrutiny. But inside the palace, no one was fooled. This was not about George's well-being, it was about control. Control over optics, over narrative, over a boy who had become the lightning rod of a deeply fractured monarchy. Yet what Camilla didn't anticipate was the quiet rebellion that had already taken root across the palace's internal hierarchy. Staff aligned with Catherine's senior aides, who had served under Elizabeth and remembered the late Queen's intent, challenged the directive almost instantly. They cited an outdated but still valid constitutional framework that differentiated between heir presumptive and heir protected under familial decree. The clause, buried deep within Royal Operations Protocol, argued that any action limiting a direct heir's exposure must receive prior approval from both the sitting monarch and the maternal guardian. Camilla had neither. Within hours, legal advisors were split down the middle. Half argued that her title allowed her to act in the name of the sovereign. The other half warned of a legal crisis, especially if Catherine were to challenge the directive publicly. That's when the term clarion override entered the conversation quietly at first, then explosively. A document long rumoured to exist, the clarion override was said to be part of Queen Elizabeth II's final codicil, granting specific emergency authority to override decisions made without full Crown consensus during times of internal dispute. No one had ever invoked it. No one even knew where it was stored. But someone whispered it, and that whisper ignited the old halls like fire licking the edge of parchment. Suddenly, eyes turned toward Edward and Anne, two of the few remaining royals rumoured to have knowledge of Elizabeth's final legal instruments. Within hours, both requested an emergency council session to discuss the legitimacy of Camilla's directive. But before it could convene, Charles shut it down. No explanation, no reschedule, just a quiet cancellation that reverberated as a silencing strike. That move only escalated the crisis. In an unexpected turn, word leaked that Catherine had begun assembling a legal advisory team of her own separate from Palace Council. It was an unprecedented move, one that struck fear into the heart of the monarchy's oldest defenders. Catherine, known for her poise and loyalty, was now preparing to challenge internal authority in a way no modern royal spouse had dared. For many, it was the moment the conflict transformed from a private feud to an institutional fracture. The press caught scent. So did the public. What Camilla had hoped would be a quiet administrative restriction had now become a constitutional earthquake. Allies were choosing sides. Historians were being called into meetings with legal teams. And beneath it all, the question loomed larger than ever. Had George simply disobeyed, or had he uncovered something the monarchy was never prepared to confront? But while the machinery of monarchy clashed behind velvet curtains, the world was watching, and George made sure his message was heard loud and clear. In a breathtaking break from protocol, Prince George released a private video shared anonymously online where he calmly declared, "I will not be crowned in silence. I will not lead a kingdom that fears truth." It spread like wildfire. And suddenly, the heir wasn't just defying the monarchy, he was redefining it. No press team, no palace coordination, no carefully prepared script. The video appeared on a dormant social media account long thought inactive, accompanied by no tags, no watermark, just raw footage. The grainy clip showed George, seated and composed, speaking into a single hand-held device. His words were clear, powerful, and unmistakably deliberate. If being royal means staying silent while people are hurt, misled, or erased, then I choose to be something else, he said. For a generation tired of scripted statements and royal detachment, it was a declaration of war against tradition and a direct challenge to the forces that tried to silence him. Within minutes, journalists scrambled to verify the clip's authenticity. It was the BBC who first confirmed its legitimacy through voice match analysis and metadata tracing. The palace remained silent, but it didn't matter. The world had already made up its mind. #NotInSilence began trending within hours, not just across the UK but worldwide. It became more than a slogan, it was a rallying cry. Students, activists, even veterans of the monarchy's staunchest traditions reposted it with messages of support. George had ignited something the monarchy could no longer contain, a movement led not by ceremony, but by conscience. First. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. William, stunned by the tone and timing of the video, confronted Charles behind closed doors. Witnesses say their exchange was short but heated. William reportedly demanded to know why no one had listened when George asked to be heard months ago, why warnings from Anne and Catherine were dismissed as maternal dramatics. Charles, already reeling from internal pressure, gave no answer. His silence, once seen as regal restraint, now felt like complicity. Mila, furious and blindsided, issued a directive for the immediate lockdown of George's digital access. But it was too late. The message had already been mirrored, downloaded, reshared across platforms and encrypted cloud drives. Catherine remained publicly silent but privately resolute. She knew what George had risked, and she knew too that the public was listening not out of curiosity but because they believed him. Perhaps most surprising was the emergence of what the media quickly labelled the young monarchists, a surge of teenagers and 20-somethings across the Commonwealth who began organising online, not to dismantle the monarchy, but to transform it. They cited Diana's legacy, Anne's integrity, and Catherine's strength as pillars of a new royal vision, one led not by fear or secrecy, but by courage and transparency. And at the center of it stood George, not crowned by jewels or decrees, but by the trust of a generation desperate for something real. This wasn't rebellion for spectacle. It was revolution for meaning, and even those who had once dismissed George as too young, too polished, now saw him as something else entirely, a voice that pierced centuries of silence with one simple truth. He had nothing to lose by speaking, and everything to lose by staying quiet. But just when the storm seemed at its peak, King Charles made one final, unexpected move that stunned the entire realm. In a televised statement that deviated from all royal scripts, King Charles looked directly into the camera and said, "Let him choose his path. A crown forced is a kingdom fractured." The nation fell silent. And in that moment, the monarchy itself took a breath and waited to see what George would do next. No background orchestra, no ceremonial desk, no antique portraits framing the screen, just Charles, seated, tired, and finally speaking from the raw center of a wounded institution. The words were unscripted, his tone restrained but emotionally charged. After weeks of internal collapse, external outrage, and a tidal wave of support for a young heir who had dared to question it all, the king broke his silence. But he didn't reaffirm control. He relinquished it. He offered George not a warning but a choice. In a move no one had predicted, Charles announced the formation of a temporary but binding council of reflection, a private, intergenerational forum in which George, alongside selected members of the royal family, would be allowed to propose reforms, question traditions, and reshape the role he may one day inherit. It was a breathtaking gesture of surrender disguised as evolution. What struck most viewers wasn't just what Charles said, but what was missing. Camilla, the ever-present consort during televised addresses, was nowhere in sight. The silence around her absence was louder than any explanation. The palace refused to comment, but insiders hinted at a growing divide that could no longer be concealed. The moment was symbolic in every way. Charles wasn't just stepping back, he was signaling to the public that he no longer wished to force the old world onto the next. That if the monarchy were to survive, it could not be held hostage by ghosts of control. Later that same day, Catherine and William appeared together at a public event, an educational trust opening in Bristol. It was their first joint appearance since the wave of upheaval began. No statements were made, but body language said what words could not. They stood close, they smiled, and the message was clear. This family, though shaken, was now aligned in purpose. Anne, ever the quiet force, was seen exiting Clarence House hours after the broadcast. When asked by a reporter if she had any thoughts on the king's words, she paused, nodded once, and simply replied, "Elizabeth would be proud." It was the only quote needed to cement the moment in history. Public response was immediate and unprecedented. Polling skyrocketed in George's favor. Commentators declared it the beginning of a new Windsor doctrine, one where legacy bowed to leadership, and silence was no longer mistaken for strength. Youth organizations requested inclusion in the Council of Reflection. Activists offered archives, academics volunteered to teach. The monarchy had long stood above the people. Now, for the first time, it seemed willing to stand beside them. As for George, no statement followed. No press release, no royal seal. He remained out of sight, but not out of mind. He didn't need to speak because in the absence of resistance, his voice echoed louder than ever. In defiance, he had spoken truth. In silence, he had moved a sovereign. And in courage, he had redefined what it means to inherit power not with pride, but with purpose. And so the boy who defied a king became the voice of a new era. But what comes next may be even more unpredictable. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.